All right, well, we'll kick things off. Good morning and welcome to the day 5 of our 5-day manager return to work workshop. As usual, I'm Scott Cuthbert, CEO and co-founder of Safepedia, and Tamara Paris is behind the scenes supporting us today. Made it to day 5. Have lots of great speakers. I know you guys have learned a ton, and hopefully you've gained some valuable insight into developing a sustainable return to work program for yourself and your organization. As we've been touting throughout the last week and a half here, Safepedia's mandate is to harness the collective genius of the health and safety industry and bringing together experts and encouraging peers to collaborate. So we've been encouraging people to join our private Facebook group, Safety Movement Makers, and connect with your peers, post some of the challenges you guys are experiencing, any ideas or questions, and we'll make sure that we get those questions answered by our experts. If there's anyone out there who would be interested in participating as a presenter or speaker, or know somebody who might be a great expert for us to tap into, please reach out and let us know. We're always looking to connect with folks that are interested in speaking or presenting new topics and ideas. So. Like I said, we've been streaming it through the Facebook group. It's new for us, so comments, feedback, criticisms, everything is welcome. We appreciate you guys joining on Zoom as well as in Facebook Live. So yesterday we gave away 2 VIP passes to our upcoming virtual conference, Safety Connect 2020. So if you haven't registered for Safety Connect 2020, there's in your emails there's a link to join. And congratulations again to Crystal and David for winning those 2 VIP packages. Today we're talking about risk mitigation from an engineering and a medical perspective, and we've got Sam, Chris, and Dave, which I'll turn it over to them in a second. But if you have any questions, again, there's the chat box down at the bottom of the Zoom frame. Just hit chat, enter your questions, or if you're in Facebook Live, just post your questions there, and tomorrow we'll make sure that we get those answered for you. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris, Dave, Sam.
All right.
Welcome, guys.
Hey, guys. This is Dave here. My name is Dave Alexander. I'm a Toronto-based journalist, writer, filmmaker, media guy. Decades of experience sort of doing stuff with media and communications. I'm going to introduce my pandemic planning solutions partners. Right here, this is Sam Stetsko. He's an anesthesiologist and assistant clinical professor at the Department of Anesthesiology and Pain Medicine at the University of Alberta. And as well, not in the same room with me, but a few kilometers away at his place is Chris Astle, a mechanical engineer. He has experience managing biological aerosol research for bio-warfare applications. So a couple heavy hitters. Now, the 3 of us grew up together in Edmonton, Alberta. We went to school together. We remained close over the years. I moved to Toronto in the 2000s to pursue a career in various forms of media, but I do come back here often. So the question is, why am I here now during the pandemic, I guess? That's a bit of an interesting story. So back in mid-March, I was at my place in Toronto quarantining, and I got a call from Sam and Chris, my 2 best buds. And they asked if I would fly out here and give them a hand. They'd been working around the clock, sometimes 20 hours a day for a couple weeks, and they were exhausted. And what they'd been up to was Chris had seen what was coming down the pike in terms of the pandemic. And he realized there was going to be a shortage of PPE for healthcare workers. And he knew that Sam is a frontline healthcare worker. And as an anesthesiologist, Sam, he's working around the throat, which is a major site of aerosolization. So it's pretty dangerous if he's working with a COVID positive patient. So Chris sprang into action, and the 2 of them worked up a set of protocols, and they determined what the proper PPE was that could be used, and most importantly, determine what reusable PPE they could suggest that frontline healthcare workers use, because, as everyone knows, people ran out of N95s. So by the time I'd arrived, they'd already created instructional videos for donning and doffing for healthcare workers to use the proper PPE and to use it effectively. And then I started working around the clock with them too. I've been living in Sam's basement for months actually with his family. And we got 2 websites up and running. One of them hosts the videos for frontline healthcare workers. They can download them for free. And there's a set of protocols for there for free as well. And then we also wanted to do a website for friends and family and strangers to give them protocols to use in everyday life to help keep them safe during the pandemic. And so that's pandemicplanningsolutions.com. And so then out of there, it kind of evolved into, well, we should start a company if we're going to be doing all this. And so we did. And that's been the last few months of work. We're in our infancy, of course, but we have consulted with the film industry in Toronto and obviously done some work with healthcare. So things are moving. And I don't know how long I'm going to be here, but it's great. Edmonton's not a bad place to be during the pandemic because the numbers are pretty low and the summers are nice. And mostly I'm pleased to be here today and to be have the opportunity to do this with Safepedia. So without any further delay, I'm going to throw it over to Sam.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Thanks to everyone else for tuning in today. As we're all aware by now, we're kind of dealing with an extremely deadly virus throughout the world. So I wanted to just fill you in a little bit about some of my medical takes on this, some of the statistics, and again, if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to field those as we're going along here as well. Just knowing what COVID-19 is, it's extremely transmissible virus, and probably more so than any other previous coronavirus or influenza outbreak in the past. It doesn't care who it infects, it doesn't care when it infects, and it is literally killing millions of people. Its sole purpose is to find a host and replicate in the host cells. That's it. The incubation period, the time from when you become infected to when your symptoms will come on, is anywhere from 2 to 14 days. On average, it takes about 5 days. Interestingly, and I think very scary for transmission rates, not every infected person shows symptoms. Recent articles actually estimate that up to 60% of infections are from people with mild or no symptoms, so they call these asymptomatic spreaders. Or it's also possible to spread the illness before you show symptoms, usually up to 3 to 4 days before, and that's called pre-symptomatic spread. So that's the time when we're probably all most at risk. Sorry, just a little, there we go. So the modes of transmission that we see most commonly, that everybody's talking about for sure, is contact and respiratory droplets. They talk about touching a contaminated object or a surface, touching your mouth, your eyes, your nose. So this is why we're hand washing. The idea that you could cough or a sneeze can spread this to people in close contact. So that's why there's social distancing. But I think the biggest one that's been missed, and I think that most physicians, many scientists are talking about aerosolization of this virus. That's the smaller particles that will remain in the air and travel further than this social distance that we're using. The one great thing about the medical community is, even though governments may not share information because of whatever political reasons, physicians still share. And I remember early on, even the end of March, we got a 150-page document from doctors from China that were basically saying, we're sorry this happened, we can't do anything about it, but we can share what we've learned. And one of the biggest things they were talking about was aerosolization of this virus. And this came out very, very early for any of the North American sort of wave of this pandemic. So we have known about these things early, and physicians have been sharing this, and scientists. So now you might be wondering, do only older people get sick and die? Because that's one of the things in the mainstream media, talking about comparing this to the flu, etc. So I delved into some data on this. The CDC says 33% of patients in the US that were hospitalized with COVID-19 are between the ages of 20 and 54, so working age. One hospital in New York City had 1,000 consecutive patients admitted for COVID-19. 54% of the hospitalizations were working age, and 57% of the ICU admissions were actually working age. So more than half are young people. In Philadelphia, New York City, at Mount Sinai Hospital, 40% of their patients presenting with large vessel strokes in the months of March and April were less than 50 years of age. That's almost unheard of previously. In the first 2 months of the Wuhan surge, based on a Harvard study, 56% of all COVID positive patients were 20 to 59-year-olds. So working age people are definitely at risk. So again, is this just like the flu? Well, we can immunize, not always perfectly, against the flu. COVID-19 immunization, obviously, you've heard in the news, is extremely difficult. The virus mutates quickly, and we don't know if the immunity will last even if you get immunized. Out of interest, 20% of the common colds are also coronaviruses, and we have no immunization to date for the common cold. So, and that's been around for many, many years. So majority of influenza cases are in under 2-year-olds and over 65. That's been well documented. And there's much lower death rates with the flu across all age groups. This graph actually shows there's a 50 to 70 times more death rate in 45 to 64-year-olds compared to the flu. That's a significant increase, I would say. The other thing that's interesting about COVID that may not come across in the media, because they talk about pneumonias and lung and people dying on ventilators, is COVID causes a clotting illness, extreme clotting illness that the flu does not cause. The flu usually just affects the lungs. It's very actually unusual for a virus in general to cause any type of a clotting situation in the body. But that's a major cause of death that we're seeing with COVID-19 and throughout the world right now. So why should the average working age individual pay any attention to this virus? Well, I present a case study here of a Broadway actor, Nick Cordero, who's 41 years old, no pre-existing health conditions. He was misdiagnosed with bacterial pneumonia around March 20th of this year. He was admitted to intensive care on April the 1st, and they found him positive for COVID-19. He was placed on a ventilator. He was induced into a coma medically. About 2 weeks later, on April the 18th, he had his right leg amputated because of clotting complications that we just talked about. A temporary pacemaker was placed for a low heart rate on April the 24th. They did a CAT scan of his chest April the 30th, and it showed his lungs had so many holes in it, it looked like he'd been smoking for 50 years. So this is literally like a month and a half after he got this. He had a tracheostomy tube placed May the 1st. And then, like we see with COVID, he started to get a little bit better. And it almost gives families hope in these situations. They started to improve, and then he deteriorated until the end of May. They tried stem cell therapy with him on June the 4th. And then he deteriorated over the month of June. He lost 56 pounds during this, and he died of lung failure on July the 5th. So he was in over 90 days in intensive care unit for otherwise healthy 41-year-old male. So it's truly tragic story, but there's just many, many stories like this coming out in the medical journals. So it's not just older people, young people that are dying from this. So now the time cost. If you were to get the flu, most people would probably lose about 1 to 4 days of work from that. Those just exposed to COVID-19 and asked to quarantine need 2 weeks off because of that incubation period we talked about earlier. And those who get sick, they're on average, they're ill for about 10 days. 1 in 10 of them, the symptoms last longer than 3 weeks. And 1 in 20, they're lasting longer than a month. And there's also these so-called long haulers. They have a months-long illness. Like it literally, symptoms come in waves. They have severe fatigue. They're relentless symptoms. They can't concentrate, they can't exercise, let alone go back to work. So how long are you infective when you get COVID-19? Some suggest about 7 to 10 days, but the definite answer is still unknown. So bottom line for all the working age population is that even if you didn't get sick or die from this virus, the overall loss of production and income during quarantine or recovery from a lasting illness is massive. In comparison to the flu, especially. So my experience from the healthcare front line, so with over 20 years working in operating environments with sick patients, including a stint in Afghanistan at a war zone hospital, I've literally only worn an N95 respirator a handful of times for suspected tuberculosis. So we never use it for influenza because it's not considered high risk to me as a healthcare worker. Especially we get immunized every year generally. And most of the precautions are put into place to prevent us spreading it to patients or patients spreading it to each other. So there really is no reason for me to wear a respirator on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, sometimes we're not even wearing regular masks when we're in the operating room. It's not necessary for putting in intravenous's and doing things like that. So now with the COVID-19 pandemic, I wear N95 respirators almost daily. And again, most of this is to protect myself. And that's new territory for healthcare workers. Usually we're there just for the patient. And it's a totally different mindset to worry about yourself. And before, I've just used universal precautions because I was worried maybe somebody had HIV, hepatitis. But that's a very, very low risk for us. But this is a much higher risk right now. Highest risk as an anesthesiologist. Sorry, I'm too far here. Again, this is not necessarily, I am the highest risk provider because we're constantly putting in breathing tubes in people. But when I'm staring down a trachea, I'm actually wearing full protective equipment. So I'm wearing the N95 respirator, a face shield, goggles, full gown, the whole situation that Chris and I came up with. So I put on a bib on my neck to cover it. So I'm basically covered head to toe so I won't get any type of virus on me. So that's not my highest risk point. It's actually when I arrive at the hospital, what I've noticed is that we have to go through manually operated doors, take elevators. I'm in a cramped locker room where people might come in, they're not wearing face masks. In the bathroom, crowded lunchrooms. I've noticed, there'll be 20 doctors sitting in a lounge, and of course to eat, you have to take down your mask. So to me, these are the times where I feel like I'm actually highest risk, and that would be no different than a workplace environment. And in fact, they have shown there's been spread in hospitals, largely in part due to this sort of asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic spreaders. So again, it's easy to become complacent with that. When our numbers are down, we have low casualty rates. Our city in Canada has that. Actually, it's fairly controlled. It's starting to ramp up right now because we've opened up businesses and such, probably a little too early from our perspective. But things become out of sight and out of mind. We forget the details that matter. And in fact, an entire hospital closed in our city because they weren't doing proper cleaning protocols. They were moving between wards, doctors not wearing masks, and they had a massive COVID outbreak, and they just shut the hospital down for 2.5 months. So it won't even open until the end of August. So our hospital has to pick up a lot of the slack from this, open extra trauma rooms. And because they just weren't taking it seriously enough, because there just wasn't enough COVID around for them to worry about it, they thought maybe they were free and clear. And actually, we finally saw almost total mask wearing compliance in our hospital after this hospital was shut down. So we were probably just lucky before this all came through. So now, risk mitigation beyond these serious health implications that we talked about with COVID, the economic implications are the same for healthcare workers as industry. If a hospital closes, they shut down elective surgery. Like I was laid off for 6 weeks because we weren't doing elective surgery. We just had people there for emergencies. And because there's 70 anesthesiologists, we didn't only need about 3 or 4 a day to do the emergency stuff. I worked very sporadically for between middle of March and the end of April. But now it's ramping up again, and so we're very busy. But if it closes, your income goes down the same as anybody, and other hospitals have to pick up the slack, exactly like what's happening in Edmonton right now. So, and also the thought from public health experts is that if you have one COVID positive patient, you probably have to quarantine 70% of their contacts in order to decrease the spread of this virus. So essentially, one worker, one healthcare provider gets sick and they find out, they have to shut everything down. So you'd have to shut down an entire business. 70% is a lot of people. And how do you pick the 70%? So everybody could have been exposed to that one individual. So I think the one way to look at it is you can, with proper PPE, like even for me, my relative risk of getting COVID only goes up about 1.3 times the general population if I'm doing things properly. And And that's even with exposure to multiple severely ill COVID-19 patients. So taking precautions, I think, works in any setting. And I think industry can lower their risk by paying attention to details like a hospital, using proper technology, equipment, protocols, and cleaning. But you have to kind of reorient your thinking to protect your workplace and your business. And again, you're unlikely to have numerous sick people in a workplace. It's going to be these asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic spreaders that you're going to have to worry about, the breaches of protocols and the unknowns. So you have to be very proactive about fighting COVID-19. So what are some of the stuff we still don't know? These are kind of our top questions as a company and as friends. Is, how much of this is this asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic spread? Estimates are about 60 to 70%. Is there a seasonal or a weather impact? We're seeing it in the Southern Hemisphere the same time as the Northern Hemisphere. It's very doubtful. I mean, the flu happens seasonally in these areas. So it's happening in the summer here, when it's the winter down in South America. But we're seeing it all over the world right now. So unlikely. Will we ever have acquired immunity? Is it like the measles or the common cold? I mean, again, we can't immunize against the common cold. Is there a risk going to the bathroom? Is there aerosolization happening there? And we all have to go to the bathroom. I'm sure you could wear a mask in the bathroom, but it's probably not going to protect you. You need an N95 in that situation. Long-term effects. These are the things that I think we're really, really seeing right now in the hospitals. Is young people, they might not die from this, but they're getting almost like a smoker's lungs. They're getting a stroke. They're having heart damage. There's infertility happening in males. And I think the biggest one is kidney failure. There's estimates that 2.5 million people will be on dialysis after this in the United States of America alone, just based on COVID infections that they had. And these could be young people. So you may have a lasting implication to your life, your livelihood, etc. So I think we need to really answer some of these questions quickly, or at least try to mitigate our risks. So with that, I'm going to pass over to my good friend Chris and have him talk a little bit more about some of those strategies.
Great. Thanks, Sam. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks, Scott and Saferpedia, for giving us the opportunity. Sam mentioned some of the things that we don't know. And really, there's a lot that we don't know about this virus. But yet we get a lot of information on this virus, really an avalanche information from multiple sources, whether it be international organizations, national, local, the news media, of course, and academics. So it's a big job, and it's in a lot of ways an impossible job to keep up with all these different sources of information. And one of the big questions is, who do you listen to? Where do you go for that information? And it's a tough question, and really it's a question that in a lot of ways it depends. So it depends on both the type of information you're looking for, as well as what information you're going to. So what source you're going to. Typically, what we've sort of observed in this environment is the more broad the organization, if you go to an international organization, their views and their opinions and their suggestions tend to be very conservative. So, which in a lot of ways makes sense, because their recommendations and views have broad implications. But when you are looking at that information, it's helpful to keep that in mind, because it will have a certain bias. It also depends on your background and on your depth. So, this is an area when we're talking about viruses and small particles, a lot of what we're seeing isn't really logical. A lot of the mechanisms we're seeing and a lot of the different observations that are being made in the science, you wouldn't guess as a typical person that doesn't work in aerosol science. So, extrapolating too far beyond, what is in a paper or what you hear can be a risky thing, because maybe it's a wrong assumption, maybe it's a wrong extrapolation. And of course, bias is everywhere, and we all know that. And what we've seen in this period is that we've observed bias change even within the same organization. So on different issues. So who you should listen to is is a question that, you know, won't have one answer on any one issue, and is something that's going to have to be evaluated kind of on an ongoing basis. One other thing I wanted to mention was the fact that information in some contexts can be a risk. So the work that I've done with, you know, biological warfare organizations and militaries all over the world, one of the things we would do often is we would do simulations. And part of the simulation that we run would not only cover, you know, the agent that's been deployed on a population, but would also cover, well, how do you deal with it from a population perspective, from a communication perspective? And there is an obligation by international and local, or international and national organizations to prevent panic and to keep order. And that's why, you know, the broader the organization is, the more careful they have to be with what they say, because with a situation like this, where the situation is evolving rapidly, and this is a brand new virus, we really know very little, if anything, really, about it. You've got to be very careful about what you say. And one of the areas that I believe this has really came to the forefront already is with masks. So N95 masks, the supply chain for these, for both the materials to make them as well as the finished product, are quite fragile, actually, because the demand can really peak and trough. And that was observed previously in the H1N1 virus. You know, what the demand that was caused by that virus at that time really caused the backlog of orders that lasted about 2 to 2.5 years to fill. So that really shows us the fragility of that supply chain. So when these organizations come out and advise people not to wear N95s, certainly part of that might be due to the fact that there are people within the population, namely, you know, the doctors and the first responders, that really do need those devices. So if there was a huge run on those devices, you know, your most valuable asset in way of preventing and stemming the virus might actually not have them. So information can sometimes be a risk. So that's another thing that, you know, is helpful to keep in mind when you're digesting this information. For whatever reason, my screens aren't advancing now. So maybe what I'll do really quickly is I'll reshare. Okay. Anyhow, so what? You know, information comes from many sources. Information can be biased and has different context, and can vary anywhere from being very, very technical to, you know, being something that you see on the 6 o'clock news, which is great, because all people need to know this information. But so what? So how does this impact you in your efforts to help the workplace? Well, really what this tells us is that information will evolve and will continue to evolve on this virus. So really this training and this, you know, observation and this planning really isn't a one and done. This is something that we're going to have to consistently go back and keep our eyes open and our ears open to adjust, because risk elimination really won't exist for some time, if ever. Really, the elimination of this risk will only happen when we have an effective vaccine or a very, very effective treatment for symptoms. And that's nowhere on the horizon. You know, if you listen to experts in the media, it sounds like anywhere from 12 to 18 months will be, hopefully, if there is ever a vaccine, when a vaccine will appear. You know, and like Sam said, because this virus affects so many areas and the symptoms are so broad, you know, finding a very effective treatment for all of those symptoms might be a very tough thing to do. So we're in an era of mitigation of risk. We're definitely not in an elimination type situation. We've got to mitigate this risk, because we're not going to be able to eliminate it. So what do we know? Sam mentioned quite a few things that we don't know about the virus, but we do know a few things. We do know that this is the most dangerous pathogen the world has seen, certainly in modern history. We know that individuals are most contagious before symptoms. We know that infected individuals can get sick. Infected individuals who never get sick can spread the virus. We know well, it's our personal opinion and our position that droplet and aerosolization dominate transmission. So this is something that's went back and forth in the media quite a bit. And of course, I'm biased. I mentioned bias before. I'm biased in the area of believing that aerosolization is a big component of how this virus is spreading so quickly into so many people. And I'll speak a little bit more about that later. We also know there's a wide variation in symptoms and health impacts, like Sam mentioned. And there's also a few things that we know from our past, just from human nature. So we know that humans tend to think short term and tend to believe that the way things are now are the way that they're going to continue to be. And that can be risky in this changing environment. And we also know, and I'd imagine for the typical audience of this talk being health and safety professionals, we also know that humans are terrible at avoiding risks that we can't see. It's easy to explain risk to a risk, or it's easy to explain to somebody and get them to modify their behavior if they can see the risk. If they can see a 10-ton beam being suspended and you tell somebody not to walk under that beam, well, that's quite a maybe, hopefully, an easy thing to explain to somebody, because the immediate risk is easy to see. It's a lot harder to explain risk and to get people to modify their behavior for risks that they can't see. And this is exactly what we're dealing with here. We cannot see viruses. We can't see infection. So to get people to modify their behavior based on something that, to them is not observable is a tough thing to do. So it's I think very important to keep that in mind as well as we progress through this, because we're going to have to take some steps that we really wouldn't otherwise have to take if it was a more observable risk. So I mentioned earlier about masks, and really, if we're still talking about information, there's been an evolution of the knowledge and the position on masks that really, starting in the beginning of March, when it really started to take hold in North America, the position initially was COVID isn't aerosolized, so really nobody needs a mask. If we go into the May-June period, the typical position started to shift to COVID may be transmitted as an aerosol, but that's really not the dominant transmission risk. So you really only need a mask if you can't maintain social distancing. If we fast forward to today, to July, most organizations now and international and national bodies are starting to come around to the fact that COVID is aerosolized, and this may be the primary transmission mode, if not a very significant transmission mode of COVID. So really to take a conservative position on this and to really try and mitigate the risk as much as possible, because again, we can't eliminate it. Everyone should try and wear a mask when they're in and among other people. So just an example of that evolution of knowledge. And really it's happened in other areas as well. If we think about the temporary use authorizations that were applied to the KN95 masks, the N95 masks that are produced in China, it happened, but then we had to retract it because we discovered that a lot of those KN95s actually were not up to spec and dangerous. Asymptomatic transmission as well. There's been sort of an evolution on knowledge on that. The length of the contagious period, the danger to those under the age of 50 or 60. So there's been quite a few of these areas, and there will continue to be quite a few of these areas that evolve in our knowledge. Yeah, Sam, if you could put up the slides, that would help. So
I was going to say, if you want to take a second and just get the slides straightened out, that's okay.
Yeah. So if now I've been talking a lot about droplets and aerosols, and again, that's my background. But I would like to right away put up a visualization for the aerosols and really show firsthand. Sam, and you're going to have to click that link because you're sharing now. What happens when somebody sneezes? Because it's kind of gross in a way, but it's quite a violent event if we if we look at it. So Sam, if you could click that link that on the screen there. Is there, has there been any questions come in, Scott, or? Here we go. Okay, so this is at a length scale of about 20 inches, and it's interesting to note that this entire event happens over a quarter of a second. So this is captured at about 2,000 frames per second. And you can see well before that quarter of a second, you can see the amount of particles and droplets that are ejected by a sneeze. Now, if we look at that a little bit zoomed back, again, this happens over about a quarter of a second over a length of about 43 inches. You can see the particles fly. And I mean, some of these particles are traveling upwards of 200 miles an hour. So sneezes are quite interesting from an engineering perspective because they're very violent events. It's interesting to note that there can be about 30,000 droplets ejected in a single sneeze. And each of those, okay, so here actually, Sam fast forwarded, we're out 23 to 26 inches here, or 23 to 26 feet. So you can see now that a single sneeze can travel 23 to 26 feet over about 5 seconds. So these are very, a single sneeze, like I mentioned, can eject about 30,000 particles. And within those 30,000 particles, you can have 200 million virus particles. So droplets and aerosols definitely are a danger here. They definitely can transmit the virus, and they are something that we've got to consider in our day-to-day sort of risk assessment. So what's the implications then for daily life? Well, fresh air is your friend. Crowds are risky. If we listen to our mom's advice when we were young, what we want to do is we want to wash our hands. We don't want to pick our nose, and we don't even want to yell, because what happens even when you're sitting breathing, you can eject virus particles. Virus particles can be ejected if you're infected. If you're talking, that increases by about 2-fold. If you're yelling, that can increase by up to 10-fold. So covering and using masks, both with the video clip that I showed earlier as well as what I just said here, you can see how that really protects everybody around you, because the majority, if not the vast majority of those particles are captured by masks. As Sam mentioned before, we don't want to touch our face because we're really giving a route for the virus to enter our body if we start to touch our nose, our mouth, and our eyes. The question of gloves, do we need gloves? Well, if you've got cuts on your hands, or if you've got a dermatological condition where you've got sort of open sores on your hands, you do want to wear gloves, because again, that's a way for the virus to enter your body. If you don't have those conditions, really our skin is an amazing barrier that protects us from things like viruses. So as long as we keep our skin clean and don't use our skin as a bridge to carry the virus into our eyes or mouth or our nose, you really don't need gloves. Breathing through your nose. Our nose, people have evolved with a nasal cavity and with hairs in our nasal cavity to actually filter out particles. Now, the primary target for the particles that are filtered out are much bigger than aerosol particles. So breathing through your nose is not an effective substitute for masks, but it still is an incremental increase compared to breathing through your mouth. We'll go to the next slide there. So how should we approach worksite risk? So I'd imagine most of the audience has seen before this inverted pyramid that NIOSH has created for the hierarchy of controls in risk. Really, the top, and as we go to the point, really the measures become least effective. And that's where personal protective equipment resides. As we go up, administrative controls, changing the way people work, and engineering controls, isolating people from the hazard are actually much more effective than just the end game of giving somebody some personal protective equipment. Really, in the context of COVID, elimination and substitution really doesn't apply here, because we can't eliminate the risk and we can't really substitute for the risk. But if we look at those bottom 3 categories in the next slide, we can see them applied to a healthcare context, which isn't exactly what the average worksite would see, but is sort of an effective way to exhibit what the type of actions they could include. So engineering controls in a healthcare example would be using airborne infection HEPA filters or isolation rooms. You know, in the context of the average workplace, this might be, you know, making sure that you've got a really good air supply and making sure airflow is constant to bring in fresh air to sweep away any virus particles that have been ejected by breathing, yelling, sneezing. Administrative controls, really, you know, at a work site requiring there be protocols that are followed so that the worker is protected as well as whoever works with the worker is protected. And then of course PPE. So, you know, having people wear masks and do hand sanitization. So how building off of that, how should we approach worksite risk? Well, a sustainable approach is needed. So, you know, it's no good to have a system that enables 100% return for 40% of the time. You know, we've really got to create systems that allow us to get back to work and allow us to expand our activity, but do that in a way that reduces our overall risk. And really, typically this is a systems approach. There's no magic bullet here. This is a system that incorporates many elements in order to incrementally and compound the risk mitigation. And you've got to approach protections in the context of sort of triage. So what's the critical path? What's the critical asset? And what are these funnels and these pinch points? What are these activities that everybody has to do? Are these areas that everybody has to pass through? And how can you mitigate risk in those areas? And you also have to consider who and what can you not afford to lose? You know, and when I say lose, I don't necessarily mean, you know, from somebody dying. I mean, who or what can't you afford to lose for 2 weeks in its most minor case? Because in many cases that has a big business effect. You know, you've got to control the highest value assets, and you've got to also consider that, you know, you're like always, consider the risk components. What's the probability of infection, and what's the impact if infection happens? So we'll go to the next slide there. Oh, I can't really see the bottom, but I believe the bottom has, in order to really approach worksite risk properly, we've got to communicate it properly. We can have the best plan in the world, but if people don't understand it or listen to it, it's really not worth much. So communicating risk from a health perspective is something that studies have actually been done on. And I wanted to put up this table, not because it's especially relevant to COVID, but it's a way of communicating information that I think gets attention and I think is worth considering as we move forward in this COVID era. So what this is a perspective scale that was created way back in '92 that instead of just putting an individual risk up on a screen, really ranks risks against one another, right? So what's my risk of getting incompatible blood? I wouldn't know. And I wouldn't know if you told me it's between 1 in 1 million and 1 in 100,000. That really wouldn't tell me much either. But if you put it on a scale like this, and you know, you see that the risk of dying from gallbladder surgery is only between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 100, well, that puts the risk of getting incompatible blood in perspective. And I think that's what we've got to start doing with COVID risk, because if we start diving down into the particulars, into the details, into the aerosol science, the challenge just about seems insurmountable. So I think this putting, you know, risk in context and in a comparative context might be a really valuable thing to do in the context of COVID. So this is a table that was created. I don't necessarily endorse the exact numbers here. Although I don't not endorse them either. I just haven't put a lot of research and science behind them. The only reason I wanted to put this table up, however, is because it, again, ranks risk relatively, and it gives people an idea of comparatively what the risks are, right? So if we go from the bottom of the breathing exposure, walking in a suburban yard, no people in sight, if we give that a relative score of 0, and then if we go up to third down from the top, walking through the cloud or cough of a sneeze from an affected person being 50, that gives you an idea of your risk. So really that tells us a couple of things. That tells us, you know, what one major mode of transmission of this virus is, and it really ranks that risk. It lets us know that it's not insignificant. This, you know, walking through that, even though that you can't see it, walking through that cloud is relevant and is important. So we should pay attention to that. it's also interesting to know that, you know, the one below the walking through the cloud, the working a shift as a cashier in a busy grocery store, ranks relatively, comparatively, are the same as walking through that cloud or a sneeze. So it also tells you, gets into the another point that I wanted to get into. I mean, to get infected with COVID, there's really an equation that has to happen. You've got to have successful infection. You need exposure, so you need a dose and a time. You know, it takes, there's estimates of you know, about 1,000 virus particles are needed to be intook by a person in order to get infected. You know, whether you get that 1,000 particles from one breath from walking through the cloud of a sneeze, or whether you get them, you know, over the course of 5 hours because you're working, you know, a shift as a cashier with a lot of, you know, small infection doses, both of those situations lead to infection. So, you know, this isn't an area, you know, this isn't a condition where if you just make sure nobody sneezes in your workplace, nobody's going to get sick. This is a condition where, you know, you've got to think about your long-term dosing effects, much the same as you do in other areas as healthcare or as safety professionals, and consider that as a system. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dave, and he'll talk a little bit more about the communication and some other facts as well. Thank you.
Maybe
Chris.
sorry, Dave. Just because I think it was relevant to some of the points Chris made. Anthony had just asked the question if we've seen any reports coming out yet as far as news outlets or World Health Organizations, if there's been any studies on the like kind of in a factory type setting where we've got machine operators and assembly workers in a closed facility, if we're seeing any studies or information come up in that environment.
Well, there have been a few, and the few that I have seen, actually, the one that jumps to mind immediately is the meat packing plants, and that has been a very, very bad experience.
Right.
And there's, looking retrospectively, there's really good reasons for that. So you've got, in that situation, you've got a factory type environment that's relatively moist, it's relatively cool, and very loud. So what you have with people working in that environment are people in close quarters and people who effectively have to yell to get over the din of the machinery. So that's really a worst case scenario. You know, throwing in that it's damp and dark, you know, the viruses can last a long time in that environment. So there have been these studies coming through, and they'll continue to be. I mean, an important thing again on information is, you know, we didn't really understand H1N1 until about 2.5 to 3 years after H1N1 peaked. So, you know, there's going to be a learning period with COVID, and we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to assume things are not a risk when they're a risk, and assume, you know, they're not a risk and they are. And there's going to be a lag there. So what from being an engineer and just from my past experience, I would always err on the side of caution. But that's a very good question, because factories, even the word factory, you know, you imagine large amounts of people. And like Sam said, what are the pinch points, you know, that they have to go through? Well, you know, bathrooms, lunchrooms, you know, anywhere where people aggregate or congregate, you know, is a risk. So there have been studies, and I'd assume there are going to be more.
There's another, and maybe Dave sees it as well, but there's another question. You mentioned airflow and fresh air. Is it too early, or has there been any proof that like a HEPA filter, or you know, or you know, some of the more advanced air filters you can put in your furnace or your air exchange are taking those viruses out of circulation?
Well, certainly HEPA filters do. HEPA filters, the categorization of filtration for HEPA does effectively capture the size of these virus particles. The question there, though, again, is I'd mentioned there's no silver bullet. In the context of overall risk mitigation, you know, if you stick a portable HEPA filter in one corner of the room, well, that's great for the air it captures. But if it's dragging that air over multiple people on its way to the HEPA filter, you actually might be increasing the risk for the people in that path prior to the air getting to the filter, right? So this has to be a system, kind of a system level way of design and way of thinking, because, you know, there have been studies of super spreader events in restaurants, for example, And just, where you are in the airflow in proximity to an air conditioner, for example, you can clearly see that by directing airflow over people who are not infected, they become infected.
And just to chime in on that too, the epitome of this is when we put a breathing tube in somebody, we hook them up to an individual HEPA filter. So the safest period of time that's why when a COVID positive patient comes in distress, they're instantly intubated with a video laryngoscope in order to put that HEPA filter on and prevent them from spreading. So once that HEPA filter's on, I tape it to my tube that's in the trachea, and essentially that's the safest period with a COVID patient, because now everything they're breathing out is going through this individual HEPA filter. So yeah, HEPA filtration will work, but it has to capture, and that's capturing everything coming out of a trachea. But I mean, if it's just like you said in the corner of a room, it's not that effective. So.
Okay. Shall we keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going.
All right. So you'll see the slide up right now that says basic guidelines and practices. Florence Nightingale, one of the most famous healthcare workers of all time, she said it best: fresh air and sunshine are our friends. UV light will kill COVID, and fresh air will, keep fresh air in your lungs, of course. One thing to think about, of course, if you live in a more northerly climate, you're not going to be able to work with your windows open come fall and winter. So at that point, you're going to, you've got time right now where you're going to want to look into your filtration systems and your airflow for once the time comes when you can't have windows and doors open. Also, protecting others will protect yourself. That's a bit of common sense. Mask up in closed areas, hand hygiene, distancing where possible. Can't say this stuff enough. It's worth repeating all the time, because it's got to be part of the sort of paradigm shift. At your workplace, this is new stuff. This is a lot of stuff to juggle, a lot of information, as we've learned. So it's a good idea to make it someone's job to search out these risks, to monitor the things that are happening, and really enforce your protocols and your safety guidelines within the workplace. That's got to happen, because as it says at the bottom here, if you're inconsistent, that's when things happen like COVID spread. Somebody doesn't wear their mask. They get too relaxed in the lunchroom, all that kind of stuff. So in terms of, making this a reality, we want to stress communication, motivation, and implementation. So, hearing some of the stuff that Sam was saying in particular, it should have made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit. And we believe that some fear is definitely good. It makes people pay attention. It makes them want to be more safe. You need to communicate that to a degree. You need to communicate the steps needed to mitigate the dangers. And you need to communicate what exactly is going to be required for this big shift in order to have long-term safety in the workplace. And then, so how do you motivate employees? You got to make them aware of the cost of the virus spread. As was mentioned, if you're out for 2 weeks, if a whole bunch of people are out for 2 weeks, if there's a shutdown, everyone's going to bear that burden. And you're going to have to motivate them by taking steps to enforce COVID-19 safety. That's what we talked about by having a safety officer. And make them aware of the benefits of maintaining a safe environment. I mean, don't forget, when you use these protocols and you take these steps, implement guidelines, you're not just keeping your workforce safe from COVID-19, you're also going to lower the rates of people getting common colds and all that other kind of stuff. And that's going to, relate directly back to productivity, lowering sick days. So there's a benefit that goes beyond just this pandemic. You need to implement your COVID-19 safety strategy. So if this is your responsibility, you want to acquire the skills, you want to acquire the knowledge, and you want to make sure that it's applicable to your particular work environment. So work with experts, become an expert yourself. And like Chris said, figure out which knowledge you can trust. And that's gonna help you going forward. So there are things to keep in mind, what we touched on, the potential costs to industry. Obviously, the loss of human life is the big one. There's catastrophic economic loss that's caused by shutdowns. The loss we talked about in terms of like a 2-week quarantine that happens if somebody shows up ill. And then the chronic conditions that can make it tough for people to return to work or to work effectively. You could expose yourself to legal risks, of course, or legal action if unnecessary risks are taken that endangered your workforce. And then, of course, something that, I think people don't think about right off the bat, but can have a really big effect is your company's reputation. Because we live in an age of social media and information sharing, and everyone, if you Google Cargill, I bet you're gonna get a ton of news stories about the COVID outbreaks at the meatpacking plants at Cargill. So, that's gonna have a significant impact. So some of the safety tools that you can use to help modify behavior to make this big shift. As you can see here, dedicated pandemic safety officer or officers, depending on how large your company is, your workforce is. You should have some sort of official protocols in place, and they should be sourced from the best and latest information. So you need to take a look at what Chris has been talking about in terms of the way information on the pandemic changes and evolves. Because you can't be using information that's 3 months old at this stage. It's just not going to work properly for you. There's in-person online learning certificate programs that could be put into place. These are things that you can use to teach people how to use their PPE properly, because you can infect yourself really easy if you don't know how to use your PPE, for example. Obviously, some stuff like visual aids, posters, stickers, signage around the workplace. This is going to help keep people aware all the time, help them remember. And memory cues are great too. I'm going to put up another slide here that's got something that we really like. And so memory cues, repetition, acronyms. So here's one that's kind of fun. Don't touch men. And men is mouth, eyes, and nose. So that's an easy way to kind of help people remember that you got to keep your hands away from your face. Don't touch men. And lastly, one of the things we really, really want to instill is that the thing about a pandemic, about a virus, is that they don't work. A virus doesn't work 9 to 5, right? It's always going to be a danger. It's always going to be out there. And so, unlike other workplace hazards, this one is going to be a hazard to you outside of the workplace, outside of working hours. So what you want to do is get your workforce acting safely before they get to work, after they get to work, in their normal lives. Because, and that's going to apply to their household, because someone in their household could affect them. Then they bring it into work. Chris made a really good point that we put in here, that home is a place where you're the most relaxed and you want to be, but it's also a place where you can let your guard down. So what I had mentioned earlier is that we had come up with a set of everyday protocols you can use at home that'll help you be safe. If you're going out for a walk, if you're going to an appointment, going to a grocery store, what sanitizers should you use? Hit pandemicplanningsolutions.com and you can find that stuff for free. And, hopefully that'll help make everyone safer all the time, because that's the goal. And so with that said, I think we can throw it over to some more Q&A. And thank you for listening to us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and mention that we're at the hour. So if people have to go, we understand that. But I think you guys are okay to stick around and answer a few more questions, because I know we got a few. Lori had mentioned that early on, and I think Sam might have touched on it, but that heat was going to be the enemy of the virus. It doesn't seem to be playing out. Is there any kind of supporting or dismissive information on that at the moment, or is it just?
Well, so that's a great question, because heat is an enemy to viruses, but not the heat that Lori is talking about there, as far as temperatures in that we're experiencing on the street. So in biological labs, we actually kill viruses all the time with heat and pressure in autoclaves. But these are temperatures that are much, much higher than we would experience even on the hottest day in the southern US. So we can't depend upon heat that we experience and that we can survive in being deadly to a virus.
Right. And Eric, and I think, Chris, you touched on it, but Eric was asking about UVC, I think, lighting. Is that an effective way to...
Well, yeah, so that's an interesting question too, because again, it is, but if we take it in the context of everyday use, UV light is effective in disrupting virus, right, in killing virus. However, you know, viruses at the length scale they're in and applied to everyday environment, typically you don't have just one virus existing by itself. You'll have cluster of viruses, you'll have viruses that have been mixed into biofilms, you'll have viruses that are shaded and you know won't be affected by UV light because the UV light actually doesn't get to the virus. So in a sort of an experimental research environment with long-term, very controlled UV application, it is successful in killing virus, but I wouldn't depend on it to kill. Personally, I would not trust UV light by itself to kill virus.
Right. Okay. One of the questions was, so we talked a little bit about masks. We've had some other presenters talk about the difference between respirator, like an N95 type filtration system, versus just the non-surgical masks. And there's been a lot in the news about mask more about protecting others than yourself. So I wonder if you guys could, so if we're assuming, you know, we're returning to the factory floor or we're returning to our office buildings, is a non-medical mask sufficient, or, you know, the cloth masks people are making at home, and is it just about protecting others, or is there some protection for ourselves as well?
Well, the one point that was on our slide was protect others to protect yourself. And that really comes to mind here, because if we imagine an environment where everyone is wearing a non-medical mask or even a homemade mask, what you're going to see are those particles that were ejected in that sneeze animation that I showed decrease or be eliminated, right? So if everybody in the area is wearing a mask, everybody's good. However, the issue is, and the risk is, when you've got the two intermixed, you're still going to have a prevalence of virus particles being ejected by those that are not wearing the masks. And typically the non-surgical masks aren't rated to actually filter out those particles. So if we stop them at the source, if we stop them at the mouth of the people that are emitting them, that's great because they're not in the air. Once they get into the air, those non-surgical masks and those homemade masks are not effective in filtering them out. So we've really got to stop them at the source.
And from in the hospital perspective, I'll often wear my N95 to go to the bathroom and stuff like that as well, because like I said, I find those places to be more risky than in the operating room, where somebody's got that HEPA filter on. The airflow is excellent in the operating rooms. So, I mean, that's one of the safest places. In fact, I've eaten my lunch in empty operating rooms because the airflow is so good, pushing everything out of that room, that it's probably one of the safest places to be. So it's, but you're right. If one guy takes down their mask in a lunchroom to eat, and everybody could be exposed to whatever they're breathing out. And so it's the time that you're exposed, the amount that you'd get. So distancing away from them, trying to spread people out in the lunchrooms, those are such important things when it comes to this mask situation. But yeah, if everybody can put a mask on, everybody can put on a reusable respirator, all their exhaled air is going to get filtered back in, you know, if everybody, depending on the type of industry you're in. So it's sort of like almost like an all or none type of situation, I think, where we have to really work together here in order for the masks to be successful. And I think that's why sort of the mandatory inside masking in cities and things like that is going to be such a key thing. And I mean, Asian cultures do this extremely well. I mean, it's part of their culture, and they've mitigated this risk huge. I mean, there's populations, 90 million people on islands like Taiwan. I might be quoting their population wrong, but they've had very few deaths from COVID in a small area with people piled on top of each other, living quarters and stuff like that, because I think they're so used to wearing masks in public spaces. And I think that's been the key for them.
Right.
And another, sorry, just one thing I'll interject there too, Scott, is it's important because some masks don't filter your outgoing air. So it's careful not to not realize that as well. So N95 masks that have the exhalation valve, as well as reusable elastomeric masks that have exhalation valves, do not filter your exhaled air. They're effective at filtering your incoming air, but not your exhaled air. So it's important that people realize that. So if they've got, a shop floor that's filled with people with N95 masks with exhalation valves, it isn't safe for somebody to necessarily come in with just no mask at all or with a surgical mask. So in the case where we're protecting others, what's getting through the mask and what we have as that barrier layer between the person and everybody else is what matters.
Right. So we're talking a lot about masks. What about the surface areas? So I know like people are like my wife's, disinfecting groceries. People are, if you go to a restaurant or you get a coffee, you're outside, you're social distancing, but you're touching a cup or something that somebody else has touched. Where are we at with those surfaces and spreading? Well,
it's definitely a risk. But really, that's not a risk that we haven't been exposed to before.
Right.
That's why as a society, we've really, over the years, gotten quite used to washing our hands. Hand sanitizer was developed especially for that purpose. And that's the thing. It's important to note and to realize and to remember that just because you're touching virus on a surface doesn't mean that you're going to get that virus. That virus needs a pathway into your body. Your skin is a very effective barrier. Your skin will prevent that happening. Where we get into trouble is when we touch a surface and then we give that virus a pathway by touching our mouth, our nose, or our eyes. We give it that opportunity to get into our body. Right.
So, and this might be kind of a big question to ask. We've had, from lawyers to, health and safety professionals talking about controls within the workplace. There's obviously been a number of companies that have been mandated to go back to work because they've been deemed as essential services. I think there was a lot of thought and controls put in place in those environments to make sure there wasn't a spread within those facilities. One of our customers produces N95s, and I mean the level of rigor they went through to make sure they could keep their facility up and running was pretty exhaustive. But now there seems to be a loosening up. I think people are tired of being pent up at home. They're seeing that the fatality rate maybe isn't as high in their demographic. So there's this wave of returning to work, and so big question for you guys. But like if an organization like us or somebody else that isn't an essential service that seems to be doing okay with people working remotely, what advice would you have? Is if you can continue to work remote from home, 6 months, 12 months, or is it okay to start returning if we're putting these controls in place? Like what maybe kind of advice could you provide?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, because there's a lot of factors at play, right? So the economy is an important thing. We all need to keep the economy going. We all need to get our work done, and there are some situations where you just can't do that as effectively at home. In situations where you can do it effectively at home, however, it's my personal opinion that you should right now, because it kind of goes to that point of protecting yourself protects others, and protecting others protects yourself. So there was a really interesting quote in Maclean's, which is a Canadian sort of news journal that comes out, and they said, there won't be a seasonal second wave to the pandemic. There will be a behavioral one, because there is fatigue with this. People are tired of having to consider this all the time. It is taxing. It is exhausting to keep these risks at the top of your mind all the time. it's my opinion, and I experienced firsthand working in the area, that it does become easier over time. You just start to not have to think about it as much. You just start to do these things, and instead of having to think, oh, I'm too close to somebody, it just feels wrong. So you just don't put yourself in that position. So it does get easier, but there is a learning curve to this, and there's an exhaustion curve to this. I think that's what we really have to battle right now. We have to battle people's behavior, not battle, but we have to help people's behavior. We have to help them get to the point where they feel comfortable enough, and we have processes that are comfortable enough that can be followed.
Right.
Yeah, I think I can interject here. I mean, because we are essential workers going back, there was a lot of fear going back to the hospital that you'd infect yourself, your family. And I go through a routine every day. I come home, I take my lunches in plastic bags now. I bleach the bags when I get home. I bleach my ID card, my phone, my everything when I come home. My truck keys, everything. I kind of keep my truck almost contaminated. And my clothes go into the laundry. I go into the shower when I get home, just because I don't know what I'm potentially bringing back, and there's too many unknowns to put my family at risk. So we go and do that, and like I said, even at work, we become complacent when we're tired. We do long shifts. So I find right now that every day feels like 1.5 or 2 days. Like, it's actually quite exhausting going in there, putting on this gear. Like I transported a COVID patient to our intensive care the other day. It took almost a half hour just to go down the hallway, essentially, because of all the gear and the whole, somebody's opening the doors for you in front, and everybody's in the gowns and the masks. And like, it was just like, I was sweating by the time I was done the whole thing. And it exhausts people. And so I think that's the same thing when industry goes back. So if you can do your work from home, I would say that's going to be easier on you, because if you go in and you have to do all these type of protocols, your productivity will go down just from pure exhaustion. People will be taking days off of work just because they need a holiday from it,
Yeah. And I think health and safety professionals they understand that message, because safe behavior needs to be practiced and reinforced and become entrenched right in our daily lives. So
and I think even mental health wise, I think and there's a good understanding amongst the health and safety people as well about mental health and how that's affected. And I think sometimes medicine and nursing and stuff does a horrible job of that, taking care of their own. Like, they kind of just expect us to grind through it. But you got to remember that this is a taxing thing. Like Chris said, this idea that it's always on your mind, this risk, can be very taxing to your workforce. And so you got to take care of them and make sure they get proper time away, and where they're not being sort of overwhelmed with all this stuff.
Right. Yeah, we had a session earlier this week around mental health and talking about the stress people are going through working from home and trying to get their kids through school, but also what's it like when they're mandated to return to work, their stress and anxiety, switching over from being isolated to being exposed. So kind of fits into my second last question here is that there's I think the good takeaway, and I'll touch on it again, is that this information is changing. We need to be the lawyers were the same, OSHA guidelines, CDC. We need to pay attention to the fact that we're learning more. We're evolving and changing protocols as we learn more. And I think you guys sort of touched on it, but there's some public officials out there, talking about eventually this virus is going to go away. And what I'm hearing from you guys is this is like the common cold. This is most likely here to stay, and it's more about how do we in the future, 12 to 18 month time frame that Chris talked about, treat people who contract COVID or potentially start protecting against it. But is this here to stay, or is this something that we can stamp out?
So there's definitely no stamping out this. The big question at hand now is how quickly does it change to the point where it's actually fundamentally different than what it started as. So early studies in this sort of pointed to the fact that every 3 to 5 generations of this virus is mutating. So if I have it and I give it to you, Scott, and you give it to Sam, and Sam gives it to Dave, by the time it gets to Dave, there's a chance that that virus has mutated enough that we can see that it's different, right? And this is really why the common cold cannot be immunized against, right? Because it's always changing, it's always mutating, so it's a moving target, right? So this COVID is not going away. You know, whether we can get to the point where we get an immunization, an effective immunization against it, or even an immunization that has to be updated, like the flu, because the flu is the same mechanism there. We'll see, but it's not just going to disappear, right? So we're in this for the long haul. You know, the flu appeared at one point and is still here. It's going to be the same with this.
Yeah. I think the one maybe possible silver lining, but again, this is a coronavirus, not an influenza virus, is the pandemic in 1918. So 100 years ago, after a few different waves, the virus became less what we call virulent or deadly. And so it was still there. Like, they didn't immunize against it. They didn't have any of the technology we have now to do any of this stuff. And eventually it was still there, but it wasn't as deadly. And I think even H1N1 has become a little bit like that as well over some time. So we would just hope that it's not so deadly, causing the clotting illness, all those kind of things, and maybe more is like a seasonal type of flu. But that remains to be seen. But that could be a possibility. Some viruses do that.
Right. Good. Well, in closing, I mean, we put together this workshop. You know, mention you guys coming in, that, you know, we do webinars on a monthly basis, but wanted to bring a series of experts together to talk about COVID-19 and how health and safety professionals, now that they've found this new role, I think appreciated that, you know, identify a pandemic safety officer within your organization, because it is something that needs some time and energy to focus. But what we wanted to do in this workshop was help create or help transition people from fear to certainty. It's not going away. There's still lots of work that needs to be done. But instead of being fearful, now we're a little bit more certain about protocols we can follow, people we can connect with, and so kind of on that note, definitely your site's a great resource. I assume you guys will be keeping that up to date with all the news and everything that's going on. And if people are, again, you know, responsible for helping their organization bring people back to work, you got your information, but they can reach out, connect with you. You guys are available to speak to organizations or do some consulting, help turn that fear into some certainty for organizations. So thanks so much. Really appreciate your time. I think it was great to close our workshop with you guys. If you have any closing remarks, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll let everybody get back to their day.
I guess I'd say if you have further questions or inquiries, you can contact us through the website. Emails are up there. We're happy to speak further. And as these guys will say too, we appreciate the opportunity today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Hey, Scott, don't you have a special announcement?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, we gave away our 2 VIP passes to our virtual conference yesterday to Crystal and Dave, but we wanted to recognize Kailash, who's been super active on the Facebook group, posting lots of great questions and collaborating in between sessions, not just during sessions. So Kailash, we're gonna reach out to you and we'll get something to you shortly as well. So thanks so much for your collaborative efforts in the Facebook group.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris, Dave, Sam.
Thank you.
Good day.